Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for coming back. Today we're going to be starting on a brand new topic. Now in this video, this is going to be, a topic about trauma and how it influences your body, your mind, why it's so hard to heal, and I want to highlight what's going on. And I want to define trauma as well. This is going to be the start to a brand new series of videos. We're going to go ahead and refocus our attention on trauma, and I think a lot of you will appreciate this topic. I've gotten a lot of emails and text messages from you, or tweets I should say, asking for trauma to come back on the scene. So we're going to go ahead and revisit trauma. Let's jump in. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel, for all of you who are subscribed and participating. And for those who are new, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button so you can stick around with us and become a part of our growing and our validating community. And in case you don't know who I am, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Tamara, and I'm an internationally and board certified trauma therapist, but I'm also licensed in mental health, and I specialize in treating children, teens, families, as well as adults in my private practice who are dealing with trauma. Let's jump in. The topic of trauma is really complex, because I think there's a lot of things that we could characterize as traumatic. Now, a lot of people believe that trauma is one specific event, and that could be a car crash, it could be a rape, it could be a sexual assault, it could be child sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. But a lot of people fail to realize that trauma is any situation that you are not prepared to cope with. It's any situation that comes into your life in some form that throws you off guard, throws you off course, throws you off of your position in your life. You get confused and derailed. You have a really hard time responding to life after the event, and you're having a hard time getting back up. It's something that comes your way that you have absolutely no coping skills to deal with. That is trauma. It doesn't have to be child sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be physical or emotional abuse. It doesn't have to be a terrible car crash, and it doesn't have to be, something very, very tragic like a massacre or, natural disasters that has flipped your life upside down. While those are traumatic as well, they have their own place in the world of trauma. We also can't fail to realize that trauma is anything that you are unprepared to deal with. It's something that you have absolutely no coping skills to come up against, so it's kind of throwing you off base, it's throwing you off course. That is trauma, and I want you guys to keep that in mind as you move forward in your life and you experience various things. You don't have to have this big major thing happen to you in order for it to be trauma. On the flip side of that is, we don't want to characterize everything as trauma, right? Because everything is not trauma. Sometimes we have situations that feel traumatic, but they aren't. Sometimes we have situations that could be characterized as traumatic, but are you responding to the event in a traumatized way? That's kind of the question that you want to ask yourself. And I think in today's video, I want to highlight some of the ways that your body and your brain responds to trauma. And this is how you know that you are experiencing trauma. Let's jump into that. All right. So the first thing that I usually highlight when I'm seeing clients who are dealing with trauma, and that could be intergenerational trauma, which I talk about right up here in this video. If you check that out after this video, you can learn a little bit more about that. It could actually just be a recent trauma. It doesn't necessarily have to be intergenerational trauma. But, if clients come in and they're dealing with some kind of trauma, here's the first thing I look for. And this is what I look for in my intakes and my assessments, is destabilization of the brain. Destabilization of the brain, okay? Really what I'm looking for is memory deficits, an inability to recall what happened. What happens with destabilization of the brain is, in those intakes and in that assessment, I'm really looking for memory deficits, an inability to recall the trauma and what happened. I'm also looking for nightmares, night terrors, bad dreams, night sweats, right? Waking up from dreams drenched in sweat. I'm also looking for focus and concentration issues. I'm looking for inattention. I'm looking for poor attention span. I'm looking for distraction. I'm looking for signs that the brain has been thrown off course, that after this particular event, there has been a destabilization of the brain in some fashion. It's not just, I can't think today. I need to get some sleep and I'm going to wake up and feel better tomorrow. This is a pervasive pattern, a chronic pervasive pattern of poor focus, poor memory, poor attention, nightmares, night terrors, sleep paralysis, right? Anything that has anything to do with the brain, I guess I could say, I'm looking for signs of destabilization of the brain. Okay? Usually when you're dealing with trauma, or you're trying to cope with trauma, it's really easy for you to experience destabilization of the brain. Trauma impacts the brain in a variety of ways, And I think I talk a little bit in this video up here, if I'm recalling it correctly, about the brain, so you can learn a little bit more about the different sides of the brain and kind of, what it is that we're looking for when we're dealing with PTSD or we're dealing with some kind of trauma, okay? The next thing that happens to the brain, when you're dealing with trauma, is there's a little bit of a disruption in how you respond to life and respond to relationships. So relationships are disrupted. I guess that could be the umbrella term for this part of the video. Relationships are disrupted. And really what I'm looking for is fear. I'm looking for fear of abandonment. I'm looking for mistrust. I'm looking for paranoia, maybe some delusional thinking from time to time. I'm looking for affairs. I'm looking for, a breakdown in communication. I'm looking for withdrawal and isolation from people that maybe, you or the individual experiencing the trauma once, had the connection. I'm looking for it to be, broken down in some way. And I'm looking for that connection to be lost, So a destabilization of relationships, a breakdown in communication within those relationships is what I'm looking for. All right. The third thing that I'm looking for when I assess somebody who may be dealing with trauma or may have PTSD is environmental triggers, if I can speak. Environmental sensitivity is something that happens when you're dealing with trauma, You have a sensitivity to light. You have a sensitivity to smell. Sounds really does trigger you, Reminders in the environment trigger you. Laying in a bed or sitting in a chair triggers you. Hearing certain things in your environment. Listening to things outside your window, right? Sitting out on your porch and feeling triggered, feeling restless because of the environment that you're in. I'm really looking for environmental destabilization, environmental sensitivity, environmental triggers, whatever you want to call it. I'm looking for that because what happens is, when you're trying to cope with the after effects of a traumatic event, you become almost, You become almost overly sensitive to stimuli outside of your body, and you react more intensely to things that other people probably wouldn't pay attention to. So like the car out there that's idling, that sounds like a loud motorcycle, is probably getting on your nerves and triggering you to think back to whatever happened to you. Whereas I might be there and just feel like that's annoying, but it's not going to derail me from what's going on right now. For people who are dealing with trauma, environmental sensitivity is a huge, huge sign that PTSD is likely, or some form of complex trauma or some kind of trauma. Environmental sensitivity. Now, think of the emotional centers in the brain. I talk a lot about that on this channel. You can find a little bit more in this video right up here. I talk about what's called the amygdala. It's a pea-sized, or I should probably say an almond size. It's a little bigger than a pea. It's an almond-sized organ in the top of your head. Basically, it's an almond size. Okay, it's an almond size, not a pea size. It's a little bit bigger than a pea size. It's an almond size, and it's in the middle of your brain. It's the emotional center, and it's kind of encapsulated by the limbic system and other parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which has a lot to do with like our drives, thirst, hunger, sex, all that kind of stuff. The amygdala is the emotional center. So any emotional memories that we may have developed has been laid down by the amygdala. Okay, so let's say you had a terrible car crash, and in that car crash, all you could smell were gases, oils, things burning, fire, so that kind of laid down an emotional memory. Let's say you're walking down the street a year later and you've kind of overcome the trauma a little bit, and you think you're healed, and all of a sudden a car drives by you and it leaves off this exhaust, fumes in the air, and you smell that, and it takes your brain all the way back to the car crash. You start shaking, panicking, your heart rate goes up. It's the amygdala. It has laid down that emotional memory of the traumatic event. And so, environmental triggers really do work on the emotional centers of the brain. It kind of awakens the amygdala, it awakens it. And that's really tough, because if you're triggered by things in your environment, it's going to take quite a while for you to develop coping skills to combat that. All right, let's go to the next one. The next thing that I'm looking for is a deadening of the senses. Now, usually people who have PTSD, they kind of go dead emotionally, and different parts of the brain kind of goes asleep for a while. It's very interesting how trauma impacts the body, the mind, the brain, the physiology of who we are. You kind of go to a different place, and parts of who you are deadens, parts of your brain deadens. If I'm seeing a deadening of the senses somewhere, then I know that, this once lively, bright-eyed person who was once engaged in life, who is now deadened, depressed, flat in their face, their affect, I know something's going on here. And that's how you know the individual most likely is suffering from some symptoms that has something to do with trauma. The once bright, happy, engaged person is now this deadened person because the brain has gone asleep. It's almost defending itself against the trauma. And unfortunately, people who have unresolved trauma, they go through that quite a bit. All right. The next thing, guys, that I want you to think about in terms of dealing with trauma, if this is you or someone is a chemical imbalance in the body. A chemical imbalance in the body. Now, when you're dealing with trauma, you're going to have a lot of stress hormone that is going to be secreted from your pituitary gland. And here's a picture of that right here so that you can kind of see what that looks like. This is the brain. And as you can see, that pea-sized organ that's hanging down from the brain is known as the pituitary gland. Stress hormone secretes from there, and it goes through different parts of the body, and it creates like this cascade of chemical processes in the body that has a lot to do with the stress response. Now, the fight or flight system gets kicked on. I talk a lot about that right up here in this video. And there's a lot of changes that happen in the body. So what I'm looking for is an individual who has been in fight or flight mode for long periods of time, even when they don't need to be, right? When you're experiencing environmental triggers, you're likely to go through the fight or flight response unnecessarily. I'm looking for a prolonged period of that. I'm also looking for moments where, the fight or flight response leads to panic attacks or really intense emotional reactions. I'm looking for that. So if I see chemical changes in the body, or I see fight or flight mode on too long or on unnecessarily, then that's a sign to me that there may be some trauma present, okay? The next thing that I have on my list is bodily shutdown. Now, one of the things that I mean by this is, poor energy, poor sleep, poor functionality throughout the day, not really being able to function in daily life because your memory is bad. You can't really function in a smooth way. All you want to do is sleep, avoid, or stay in one particular mode all day. And that could be sleeping in bed, playing video games, avoiding life. It's almost like a severe form of agoraphobia. You refuse the outside world. You can't do it, and you don't want to do it. So I'm looking for that bodily shutdown, that emotional shutdown, and that psychological shutdown. I need to know if someone comes in to see me, and this is good for you to know as well, just observing yourself and to share with the therapist if you see one, is, you need to know, and I need to know, what's daily life like for you? Are you getting up, getting bathed, and going on about your day? Or are you really stammering and struggling and procrastinating and just kind of slowing down and not really feeling like you're at your best self, That's when you know something is going on that should not be going on, okay? The next thing is perceptual disorganization, and I've actually categorized this as perceptual disorganization because here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for delusions and hallucinations. I'm looking for thinking errors, which I talk about right up here in this video. I'm also looking for defense mechanisms, which I talk about right up here in this video as well. I'm looking for your attempts to defend yourself against the outside world in a strong way. We all have a defense wall. We all have a way that we protect ourselves. But if I'm seeing the defense wall up way too often for no apparent reason, and you're defensive against the outside world all the time because you're afraid of getting hurt again, then there's probably some PTSD here or some kind of trauma, and I need to explore that a little bit more. So I'm looking for perceptual disorganization, and that's something you may want to look for, as well, which is, am I kind of perceiving my reality in a way that's not correct? And is my perception of reality really getting in the way of my functionality? That's what you want to ask, The next thing is mental inflexibility, and that's the last thing I have here on my list. Really what I mean by that is inflexibility to change, rigidity, right? You're rigid on everything, and inability to experience life because your walls are up so high, not being able to make decisions because you stammer and you have a hard time making a decision on A or B. Not being able to see the world in gray, seeing it all in black or white terms or polarized terms, right? I'm looking for that rigidity, that mental inflexibility. And usually people who have experienced trauma, they have a hard time being mentally flexible, whether that's because of the change in their fight or flight system, or it's a change psychologically because of the trauma. Not really sure. I'm not quite clear on what research is saying there. We're still kind of, studying research. Someone to really follow would be Dr. Vanderkalt. And I will actually, here's his book and his name right here. He's kind of like a pioneer in trauma-informed care. I think getting the book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a good book for you because really what it's doing is it's helping you to understand everything I talked about in this video and kind of what we look for as trauma therapists as pioneers in trauma work. I don't consider myself a pioneer, but he definitely is. For those who have been in this field much longer than me, who have studied trauma, they are pioneers in research for trauma, and they're trying to understand what happens to the body physiologically and what happens to the brain neurologically and neurobiologically, right? There's a lot of things that happens to you when you are dealing with trauma, and it's very important to understand that. You don't want to go to a general therapist. You don't want to go to a neurologist just because they study the brain. You want a specialist, somebody who gets trauma, somebody who gets neurochemicals in the brain, somebody who understands what is going on physiologically and how to put all those things together to create a treatment plan for you to help you in your healing. So if you're looking for a therapist or a psychotherapist or a doctor who understands trauma, you want to make sure that they understand the physiology of trauma, the neurochemicals that are all shooting off in your brain, and they also need to have some understanding of neurobiology as well. I hope this video was helpful to you guys. Go ahead and give this video a thumbs up if it was, and go ahead and hit the subscribe button, bell button, so you'll know every time I post a video. Every time I post a video, guys, your participation on this channel helps so much. That first hour of watching the video helps a ton, so thank you so much for doing that. It kind of gets this information further into the community of YouTube so other people can have exactly what you're watching. So thank you so much for that. I will see you guys in the next video. We're going to keep this topic going. It's very important, and I know a lot of you wanted to get back into this, so we're going to continue. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. You don't want to go to a general therapist. You don't want to go to a neurologist just because they study the brain. You want a specialist, somebody who gets trauma, somebody who gets neurochemicals in the brain, somebody who understands what is going on physiologically and how to put all those things together to create a treatment plan for you to help you in your healing. So if you're looking for a therapist or a psychotherapist or a doctor who understands trauma, you want to make sure that they understand the physiology of trauma, the neurochemicals that are all shooting off in your brain, and they also need to have some understanding of neurobiology.